service leader. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Rappahannock with these words by Dan Lambert. You are welcome here no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what your background. You are welcome here to join us as we proclaim worth in our spiritual journeys. You are welcome to join us as we sing songs that uplift our very hearts. You are welcome to join us in community as we learn, live, and love together. All are welcome as we worship that which gives us meaning and value. No matter what you call this building, this hour, or this gathering of people, we worship as one body, illuminated by the light of our chalice. The announcements are in the front of your order of service. A special welcome this morning to any visitors. We hope that you will join us after service for coffee and refreshments so we can get to know you better. And a welcome this morning also for those of you who are on Zoom. Please silence your cell phones, and if you're on Zoom, put yourself on mute. Our chalice lighting this morning is by Adam Slade. When the great mosaic of humanity is treated with respect and dignity, when no person is threatened by hunger or war, when we have extended hospitality to the stranger and tended to the sick, when equity and justice reign everywhere, then we shall all be free. We light this flame to hold that moment in our spirit and in our minds until we can make it real. Our opening words this morning are from Heidi Kottman. Let us be a faith that gathers, reaching for one another through the walls of hate that others build, through the cages of ignorance and arrogance, through the fear that burns city streets. Let us be a faith that sees a vision of a better world, more compassionate, more just, more holy, and with more love. There is a faith that binds up the broken, cauterizes battle wounds with balm of peace, sings longer and louder than the trumpets of war. Let us be that faith too. Let us be the ones who do not tread lightly in this world, but hold light, that light it up with our love, who hold up the mirror of worth and dignity, who are the sanctuary others seek. But first, let us be a faith that worships together, here, this morning, in this space, at this moment. Let us be a faith. And Diana, can you come up and talk about service as a spiritual practice?
I have two service as a spiritual practice opportunities to offer you all. The first one, which would appeared in the chalice, is we're looking for a historian to keep up our scrapbook. I don't know if you've ever looked at it, but it's in the lobby. It is the place where we collect the history of UUFR. So I invite any of you to consider that, and if you're interested, come and talk with me about that. The second is we have all of our new audio-visual equipment, and the board was generous enough to offer some funds to the, I don't know what, the audiovisual committee, so that we could purchase this equipment, and that gives us the capability of offering a more enhanced Zoom service, and also it allows Jeff to put our services on in the connections each week. So we are on the project board out front, and we are asking for donations, no matter how big or small, so that we can pay the board back after, in the months to come. So please consider a special donation for that fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. And now Susan, I believe, is going to come up and talk to us about our song, something different today.
This is something different, but I'm sure we can do this. I know we can. If the members of the Making Music who have been through these songs would just kind of gather in the back there so you give each other courage. We are combining two songs that are out of the book for our first offering today. And that is the first, Come, Come, Whoever You Are. Come, Come, Whoever You Are was a poem written by Rumi, a 13th century mystic and poet. He was from Persia, which is now Iran. And the second song is Shalom Haverim, Israeli song. What ties these songs together is Eddie's topic today, but also Come, Come As You Are was kind of a plea for anyone who's fled the church and the teachings to come back. No matter what you've done, come, you are welcome. The second song, Shalom. Shalom is an interesting word which in Hebrew means hello, goodbye, peace. Jerusalem is so named as the city of peace.
Number 188. Our speaker today is UUFR member Eddie Correia. He will provide our reading this morning, and I will introduce Eddie a little more fully later in the program.
Thank you, Janet. Reading today is from the Department of Defense Law of War Manual. What is that? Let me read you a little bit of introduction. Law of war is part of who we are. George Washington, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, agreed with his British adversary that the Revolutionary War would be carried on agreeable to the rules which humanity formed, and to prevent or punish every breach of the rules of war within the spheres of our respective commands. The law of war is part of our military heritage, and obeying it is the right thing to do, and this is taken from international law and borrows heavily from it. Just read an excerpt, 1,200 pages long, so I'm not going to read stuff like that.
Thank you.
Section 2.4, proportionality. Proportionality may be defined as the principle that even where one is justified in acting, one must not act in a way that is unreasonable or excessive. Proportionality has also been viewed as a legal restatement of the military concept of economy of force. Unreasonable or excessive force. Proportionality generally weighs the justification for acting against the expected harm to determine whether the latter are disproportionate in comparison to the former. In war, incidental damage to the civilian population and civilian objects is unfortunate and tragic, but inevitable. Thus, applying the principle of proportionality in conducting attacks does not require that no incidental damage result from attacks. Rather, this principle creates obligations to refrain from attacks in which the expected harm incidental to such attacks would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated to be gained, and to take feasible precautions in planning and conducting attacks to reduce the risk of harm to civilians and other persons and objects protected from being made the object of attack. Proportionality is also a requirement for reprisals, which must respond in a proportionate manner to the preceding illegal act by the party against which they are taken. Reading in a different section, protection for women against rape or other indecent assault. Women shall be especially protected against any attack on their honor, in particular against rape, enforced prostitution, or any form of indecent assault. Although the General Manual provides special protection for women against these offenses, all individuals, including children and men, should also be protected against these offenses. Taking of hostages. The taking of hostages is prohibited. Collective penalties in a different section. Collective penalties and measures of intimidation or terrorism. No protected person may be punished for an offense he or she has not personally committed. Collective penalties and likewise all measures of intimidation or terrorism are prohibited. Another section, no adverse distinction based on race, religion, or political opinion without prejudice to the provisions of the general standards of war relating to the state of health, age, and sex. All protected persons shall be treated with the same considerations by the parties to the conflict.
I never knew there was such a thing as rules of war. Thank you, Eddie. Let's now join in a time of silent reflection, thinking about those words. We take our offering this morning. I wish you to think about generosity, which is one of the new UU values from our revised Article 2. It reads, we cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. As we collect this offering, if you are a first-time visitor, please let the basket pass you by. Your presence here is your gift to us. Consumers can make their donations online at uufrva.org. Please know that your gifts will be used to support all that is special about our UUFR fellowship and the community. Most of you already know Eddie, but for those who don't, he is an attorney and adjunct professor of American University's Washington College of Law. Many of you have read some of the books that he has written, and he has a new novel coming out in September called Self-Inflicted. Is that a memoir? Some of you may not know that Eddie is the vice president of our board and is currently working on updating our bylaws. His talk this morning is Israel, Hamas, and Gaza, the Moral Dilemma.
I want to start out with a brief review of ethical theory. Basically, ethical theories fall into two categories. Deontological theories, which are really rule-based. The idea is that you establish some rules, you break those rules, that's immoral. The other category is called consequentialist theory, and you take into account the consequences. So both those theories have their strengths and weaknesses. Deontological theories have the great strength that it's be clear. You don't have to get into a complex analysis. You look and see what the rules are. The weakness is, first we have to come up with the rules, whether it's the 10 Commandments or some other set of rules. The DOD manual, a lot of those are deontological in nature, although when we get to proportionality, there's a measuring, a balancing that goes on. The weakness in deontological theories is that it comes up with bad results sometimes. Kant's, if you remember Kant's categorical imperative, that's a deontological system. But there's one of the rules Kant derived was no lying. So if you take your wife to a beautiful formal event and she's walking in the door and she says, "How do I look?" You don't say, "You look kind of fat and that dress is ridiculous." This doesn't come up with us. You don't do that. You say, "You look great." So deontological theories have their weaknesses. Consequentialist theories, in some ways, are more sensitive, more sophisticated because you take into account the consequences. The problem is, how do you calculate the consequences? Short-term, long-term, very difficult exercise to go through. So when we think about the morality of what Israel and Hamas are doing, you have to decide which of those categories of ethical theories you're going to use. I'm a consequentialist, although I recognize the difficulties. So that's what I'm going to talk about to do my best, but realize the limitations of that. Several threshold issues before we get into the specifics. What consequences count if two countries are at war? If one country wins, you can count that as a good consequence, but then that's a loss for the other country. So that tends to be a wash. So if two countries are at war and they have an equal moral claim, then the morality issues tend to revolve around how they conduct the war. Now, sometimes it's clear that one side doesn't have a strong moral claim. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's hard to see any moral claim for that. So you count not only the way that war is being conducted by Russia, which is itself immoral, but the original invasion itself is immoral. And so I don't think that's too hard to make a decision about that. What about Israel and Gaza? Well, the history is complicated, and the further back we go, the more complicated it is. The Zionist movement, began really at the end of the 19th century, and stronger in the beginning of the 20th century. Of course, Israel declared a state in 1948. You could say that whole enterprise was immoral, and some people certainly would take that position. A lot of Palestinians would take that position, and there's a strong argument to that effect. On the other hand, Israel has the moral claim of being persecuted for millennia. The Holocaust and so on. That was the original idea of the Jewish homeland. If we get too bogged down in the history of that, we're not going to get to the moral argument of what's going on today, because I think we're complicating the exercise too much. So let me try to simplify it, but I realize there are some limitations in this analysis. But let's try to simplify it and start with October 7th, which was the attack, the Hamas attack on Israel. At that time, Israel, a recognized country, presumably with a right to exist, a right to be free of attack, secure within their borders. On the other side, we have to distinguish, I think it's useful to distinguish between Hamas and the Palestinian people. If we look at the Palestinian people, you would say they too have a right to be secure within their borders. I mean, these were the borders that were established by the United Nations with the strip of Gaza. You realize how complicated this map is. Gaza is a very narrow strip of land on the Mediterranean. It's completely separate from the West Bank. But 2.3 million people in Gaza, maybe 3.5 million people in the West Bank. For general purposes, let's call that the Palestinian people or Palestine. Well, those people, you might say, they also have a right to be secure within their borders. So let's start out with that as our beginning assumptions. So let's turn to the moral questions. Was it morally justified for Hamas to attack Israel? Here's what happened with that attack. 1,139 people killed in a very brutal way. 251 hostages. They attacked civilians, not military targets. They attacked, to some extent, military targets, but a lot of civilians, totally innocent people. Slaughtered men, women, and children, probably raped women in the presence of their families. Very, very, very brutal attack. So, leaving aside whether Hamas was justified in any military attack, the way they did it cannot be morally justified, whether we look at the DoD manual or standards of international law. Secondly, probably the Hamas strategy was to provoke exactly something like what happened. I'm not sure Hamas would have foreseen the force that Israel used. But I think it's reasonable to assume they foresaw a very strong military response by Israel, which was going to result in the death of a lot of Palestinians, innocent Palestinians. Therefore, they, in that sense, are responsible, at least to some extent, of what has happened in Gaza. The destruction and the number of people have died. Maybe 38,000 Palestinians have died. 62% of residential units destroyed, 31 of 36 hospitals damaged or destroyed. Now, I'm going to get to Israel later, but for the moment, I think it's fair to say that Hamas was responsible for a lot of that. Was there any good? Is there any good from that on the other side that could justify it? Well, if the strategy was to undermine international support for Israel, they certainly have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They certainly have accomplished that. The question is whether that is good, whether that's morally good. Now, we started out with the assumption that Israel has the right to exist and have peace and security within their borders. So if your goal is to destroy the state of Israel, that violates our starting assumptions. So that would not be considered a morally good consequence. Another goal of Hamas probably was to undermine what may be still as a possibility, but it was getting closer, an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia brokered by the United States, which would have had some conditions in it to move the Palestinians closer to an independent state. So Hamas foresaw that, and clearly, I think most people would say, wanted to undermine that. Well, if we wanted to see both the Palestinian people and Israel secure within their borders, then that agreement with Saudi Arabia would further that goal. And therefore, undermining that goal is inconsistent with that and has to be considered an immoral or certainly negative consequence. And since we're applying consequences theory, that counts in our balancing to say that's immoral. Now, we start out with the assumption that the Palestinian people are entitled to freedom and security within their borders. Israel has not made that happen. And you might say there's some justification for it, but Israel has certainly not done that, and in many ways has stood against that and has resisted any kind of meaningful, in recent years, meaningful discussions toward a Palestinian state. But no ethical theory could justify, it seems to me, the way Hamas approached this problem. Whatever is justified on the part of the Palestinian people, and maybe you could make an argument for some violence, although I'm not sure you could, but the way Hamas did it cannot be morally justified. You cannot justify trying to destroy the state of Israel, and you can't justify the way Hamas has approached it. Now, it leaves the question, well, what are you going to do? What is Hamas going to do? What should it do? What should the Palestinian people? I think that becomes a very complicated question. The use of force is probably not going to accomplish anything. Honestly, the best thing Hamas could do, probably could have done, I'm sure it could do it now, was to disband and give its support to the governing power in the West Bank, which is Fatah, as shaky and corrupt as that organization sometimes is, but in other words, a unified government for the Palestinian people, and then work for peace and security from that perspective, try to gain international allies. They didn't do that. Why? Because they want power. That's Hamas. They don't want to give it up. And they want to destroy Israel. So inconsistent with that approach. All right, let me turn to Israel's response. Can their actions be justified? Well, let's divide it into two categories. One is retribution itself, and the other is preventing future attacks on Israel and promoting Israel's security. Consider retribution itself. Now, the actions of Hamas were brutal and horrible. But is retribution ever justified? Hamas has maybe 30, depending on Israel's estimates, 30 to 40,000 militants. The result of the war so far has been about 38,000, 39,000 people killed, the overwhelming majority of which are civilians. They're not part of Hamas. Maybe 10,000 people from Hamas have been killed. Well, it can't possibly be moral to kill 30,000 innocent civilians for retribution, assuming that it's moral to kill anybody for retribution. How about killing members of Hamas? Well, of the 40,000 fighters, Hamas fighters, how many people were involved in that October 7th attack? I don't know, a few thousand perhaps. Maybe if you put everybody on trial, if we had a court of law, you would convict 1,000 people, and maybe you could sentence them to death, and maybe you could say that's morally justified. But to kill thousands more for retribution alone, it seems to me is immoral based on a proportionality, balancing analysis. Now, of course, retribution is not the main goal. The main goal is the security, from Israel's point of view, is the security of Israel. Can they be justified based on that goal? Well, there's a big factual question there about whether killing members of Hamas, and with the corollary effect of killing thousands of innocent people, is that going to promote Israel's security? I mean, would a realistic analysis tell you that's the result? It seems to me that there's an equally good argument, or a better argument, that what happens when you do this kind of massive destruction is for every Hamas fighter you kill, you promote the recruitment of more, an equal number or more people to be permanently, to commit their life forever. Think about if you're a young man in Gaza whose family has been killed. Think you're going to be very supportive of future negotiations, with Israel? I don't think so. I think you may find yourself committed for the rest of your life to become a member of Hamas, or whatever the equivalent of Hamas is. So just as a factual matter, I think that strategy of massive destruction is not consistent with peace and security for Israel itself. So we can't count that as a good consequence. Now, consider the way Israel has gone about this. Even if you thought Israel's attacks were legitimate, think about that proportionality idea. The number of civilians killed far exceeds far exceeds the number of Hamas fighters. Now, I realize that it's a very big dilemma for Israel about what to do about this. Hamas clearly stations itself within civilians. It entrenches itself in the civilian populations, in hospitals, in mosques, in refugee camps. It would be somewhat like facing a situation where in the United States, we had a group of hostages, seize a group of terrorists seize 100 hostages. 5 terrorists seize 100 hostages. What do you do in that situation there? Let's say they're holding them in a church or holding them in a barn, and you just cannot find a way to disable them or disarm them. An attack is going to be a very bloody situation. That's the dilemma. That's not an unrealistic dilemma. Our police officers face that. I think the consequentialist negatives is not a very courageous way to deal with that, but the consequentialist would say, you gotta find another way. All right, so let's conclude this way, and then I want to hear your views and I want a discussion about this. We start out with the assumption that both Israel and the Palestinian people are entitled to peace and security within their borders. I have concluded that Hamas's actions cannot be morally justified, certainly in their approach and the way they did it, but probably even with their basic goals, their basic strategy can't be justified. So I think Hamas has got to be judged to be engaged in immoral acts. Israel has certainly a right to defend itself, no doubt about that. But I don't think the way they have gone about it, or maybe their basic analysis of how to approach the problem itself, makes any sense. And therefore, even though they had a right to defend themselves, I think the way they have gone about it cannot be morally justified. Now, it's not an easy problem, but I think what we have to do is step back from this and think what can be morally justified, and then hope that there are people, leaders in our country, leaders in Israel, who can find a way to do it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we have, there we go, time for questions and comments.
After just the context, and this is going to reveal my lack of understanding of the very delicate situation. Hamas itself, is that a nation state?
No.
In this area?
No, Hamas, if you could call them a political party if you wanted to, but they are a group of people who were elected in 2006 to take control of Gaza. They haven't had elections since then. We call them a terrorist organization. I think that's probably a fair assessment. But they were elected at one point to be the governing authority. And they fought essentially a civil war with Fatah, who's the authority in the West Bank. And those two governing authorities have been at odds ever since. But if you have a free and fair election today in Gaza, hard for me to think that the people would say, yeah, we think these guys have done a great job.
Just a quick follow-up again for context. Is there a leadership structure that is known and recognized and accepted of Hamas, both by Gaza, by Israel, by other nation states in the world?
Well, one of the ironies of this whole thing is that the leader of Hamas is in Qatar, openly revealing who he is, and he's protected by other countries. We view the whole group as a terrorist organization, but that's some Middle Eastern countries do not. And if they decided to arrest him and take control of Hamas, they could, but they're not going to do that, and they don't want to do that. Yeah, but
Barbara has a mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It just seems to me that because there's so many political issues in Israel having to do with how they approach the war. I agree with you that the October 7th actions on by Hamas were terrible, and Israel had a right to respond. But Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has a lot of baggage. He's only prime minister because of very far right and Israel is supporting him. And there's so many things going on that that the United States tried to avoid, like using 2,000-pound bombs on a population, a defensive population. Do you feel that if someone else had been Prime Minister of Israel, things would have been handled better? Because Israel's lost a lot of support and throughout the world because of their actions.
Well, you put your finger on a very important part of this whole tragic situation. I'm going to get to your question in a little bit, but let me comment on some other things. Netanyahu doesn't, the way the Israeli system works, he doesn't have to call elections until October of 2026. He could call elections now. If he called elections now, he would lose by a large margin. And that would, the Likud party and the right-wing party would clearly not have seats in the Knesset. He wouldn't be prime minister anymore. He might be subject to criminal prosecution himself. So we're stuck there, and he doesn't have to call elections. Until he calls elections, it is very hard for me to see how pressure from the United States, and I think there ought to be more pressure from the United States, but I don't care what pressure we put on him from the United States. I don't see that government calling elections or having a no confidence vote. I think they're going to stick together. And you're right. There's a right wing that is further right from Likud. And if you listen to what the people there say, a lot of those people say there shouldn't be a Palestinian state. There shouldn't be Palestinians. Their goal is ultimately to take over the West Bank completely and to drive people out of Gaza. I mean, that's the way they talk. And that's really makes this a very complicated situation. And I haven't talked about what's going on in the West Bank, but what's going on in the West Bank is terrible too. Abuse of Palestinians, expansion of the settlements. So that group of people and that coalition are not going to solve this problem. So we have to look ahead to some other group of people to be able to do that. But it's a real problem. Now, to get back to your difficult question, what would they have done? I have a feeling there would have been massive response too. I mean, what happens when a country is attacked like that is, and Biden himself said this, your outrage takes over your actions. And you can't be governed by that. If you go back to 9/11, the way we reacted to 9/11 was probably not in our long-term interest, and probably not in the long-term interest of the stability of Iraq and the whole Middle East. But we were so outraged that it clouded our thinking, I think. And it could have clouded their thinking too, or whoever was prime minister. Maybe not to this extent, but.
There we go.
Yeah.
I would like to ask a more broad question.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't rules of war an oxymoron?
Well, you raise a good question about whether war itself is immoral, and there are some people who certainly take that position. I mean, our friend the Quakers, do we have any folks from the Quakers here today? You know, I think it's fair to state that position. Now, that's not my view. I mean, if you have a Hitler trying to take over Western Europe, and he's marching through Poland, and it's a horrible, consequences for people. Somebody has to stand up to him, and the only way to stand up is military force. But that's my view. But there is a principled argument that war itself is immoral. I think it just gets you into a dilemma. What do you do if you have a Hitler?
So this may show my ignorance big time.
No, it won't.
Correia, 2 states within one country, that has a demilitarized zone between them. It's not perfect. What would that look like between Israel and Palestine?
Well, Palestinians would take that in a minute. You know, the problem is that that presupposes the Palestinians have independent control of their territory. And you'd have to recognize what their territory is and respect it. But within those territories, they'd be a sovereign nation. Israel has inched up to this in the past, you know, with some very heroic people. Rabin got very close to that. Even Clinton, in his discussions, but Arafat pulled away from that. The problem on both sides has been that everybody realizes you've got to take risks for peace. And when they've inched toward it, the extremists on both sides have blown it up. And that's true on the Israel side, and that's true on the Palestinian side. So you just have to try it again. I mean, the lesson shouldn't be you can't do it. But if you could have a DMV or something, you know, I think Palestinians would say yes. The Israelis would say, we cannot do it. Certainly the Likud coalition in power right now would say, we cannot accept the idea of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state because they're going to be too much of a threat to us. That's sort of, you know, and I'm sorry to say, I think most of the Israeli public might be in that place too. When you started out, I thought you were talking about my family. Correia, no. Okay, you said, you know, no, you're talking about different Correia. Yeah.
Thank you, Eddie, for going through this and opening on these issues. Henry also mentioned the anti-Semitism problems that are tied to this, and even here in the U.S. I think that whatever we can come up with, and maybe as we on a UN basis or whatever it is, if UN ever becomes really functional, to develop a plan that can resolve this. And the most difficult part of that plan, I think, is developing the optimism among all the participants that the plan will lead to a solution. And I grabbed something that just came across my desk a day or two ago. And this is a writing by Rabbi Wolfike, who's the rabbi at the Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. And he said, I imagine myself in conversation with my great-grandfather. And I say to him, you know, there's an anti-Semitism at Harvard. And he says, in my shock, there are Jews at Harvard?
Yeah.
And then he says, yes, but some of them hate Israel. And the grandfather then says, there's an Israel? Those kinds of can-do thoughts that carry optimism forward and saying, we can solve this. But you need that optimism that it's doable.
Yeah.
And that's what's missing, I think.
Yeah, well, that I totally agree with that. Optimism is an optimistic word in this context, but at least some degree of confidence that a peace agreement might hold and people might respect it. And you have to convince people on the Palestinian side who have decades and decades of distrust and what they see as treachery and deception, and you have the same feelings on the Israeli side. Unfortunately, I mean, what's happened to Israeli society is really tragic. It's the fact that they were close to a peace agreement in the past and it blew up in everybody's face, and the fact that the Palestinians can't take yes for an answer, you know, this has created climates of distrust on both sides that are enormously hard to work through. as I say, I don't think that's means you give up, but it's going to take some real leadership. If you go back in the history of the Middle East, and when you see agreements, what you see is courage. Sadat in Egypt, Rabin in Israel, people willing to take a political risk. Let me say one word about anti-Semitism. I totally agree there's an element of anti-Semitism that's always present. I think the hard thing to do is separate anti-Semitism from anti-Netanyahu feelings or anti-Israel feelings, because those are different ideas. But yeah, the anti-Semitism thread, winds its way through this.
Thanks, Eddie. That was a very, very good summation of the situation. I was thinking of Bertolt Brecht comment of erst kommen die Fresse, then kommen die Morals. First you eat, and then you have morals. And Israel is kind of in that dilemma right now. As you point out, I mean, there was an incursion on their soil that killed them. And the problem for Israel is it's not just there. I mean, they've got Hezbollah to the north. They are surrounded by the adversaries.
Yeah.
They can't appear weak, otherwise they leave themselves open to those kind of problems. The suggestion for a DMZ would be great, but then you would push the West Bank to a strip of 100 yards wide, as you needed a DMZ wide enough to be...
Unless you widen it on the other side.
That's right. That's not going to happen. You know that's not going to happen. But I mean, and Israel has responded that way since their inception. When they're threatened, they have attacked. And it's easy for us to sit here and say, yeah, the moral thing to do is what they're not doing.
Yeah.
And the difficulty for us is that we shouldn't stop and say, well, it's okay because they're threatened.
No, I agree.
Extraordinarily difficult problem.
It's a difficult problem. If you go back, this is why it gets really complicated if you start looking back into history. I totally agree from the feeling of Israel, and I fully understand this. That's a bad neighborhood. That's a tough neighborhood. And if that's where your homeland is, you look around you on every border, and it's hostile. Now, it certainly was in 1948, and they were attacked in 1948. As soon as they declared the country, they were attacked. And the lesson for them is, we got to be the toughest guy in the neighborhood. And we got to stand up to the bullies, and we got to be willing to use force whenever somebody threatens us. The problem with that strategy, and it's worked for them so far. Do you want to call this success? I mean, it's a very successful country, and a lot of people, and a very developed economy, and so forth. Whether that is a strategy that can work for another 50 years, I do not know. I mean, when you think about the technological issues of how easy it is to put together nuclear devices and learn how to deliver them and so forth, and the crazy fanatics that live in that neighborhood, I just don't know if that's a long-term strategy, but that certainly has been the one they have followed.
Considering, as I understand it, in 1987, I believe it was Hamas who came out with a manifesto for the destruction of Israel, which was modified in the 90s to destroy Jews throughout the world. So my question for you is, if you had the power to speak for both sides and to reach a settlement, realistically, what would that be?
Well, one thing, you have to get Hamas out of power. I totally agree with you. That is an organization that has, if you look at their principles, it has nothing to do with reconciliation or living side by side or DMZs or any of that. It's destroying the country of Israel. Whether that literally means killing every Jew that lives in Israel, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people hold that view. But you cannot have Hamas, an organization like Hamas, that has political power, because you'll never have an agreement. So they have to be pushed out or edged out, or in Israel's view, killed. They cannot have any governing authority to do what happen. Now, how you get there is a more difficult problem.
What would you do?
What would I do? If I were president of the United States? Or if I had absolute power? Hey, I like this idea.
You're the leader of Israel. How would you explain?
What you have to do, and I hope whatever government we have in a few months, it has to work with the allies and with the Middle Eastern countries would seem rational, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, I hope Egypt, to say Hamas has to be edged out of power, pushed out of power. And you have to leverage Israel, whether you withhold weapons or withhold resources or something, to say you have to be willing to take risks for peace. And you have to have a governing authority that has control in Gaza, that's run by the Palestinians and other Arabs, can't be run by Israel. And just take risks for peace and have it be a situation where you cannot, if you're a terrorist and go through the net and try to blow it up on both sides, you have to say you have to live through that to get on the other side of this. Otherwise, it's just not a sustainable situation.
I know we have lots of people who still have questions, but we're already past our time, so I'm going to cut it off right now to continue. Thank you, Eddie, for
Sure.
very much. We now have a closing song. If you'll please stand and body your spirit as we sing our final hymn, number 318, This Is My Song. Extinguish this chalice with words by Maggie Lovins. We extinguish this flame, but not its meaning and mission in our hearts. Our time together has come to an end. Go in peace, be of service to one another, and may you move through the world in love for all your days.
Yeah, well, let us hope as we go from here that the powers that control Gaza and the Israeli government now will be pushed out or voluntarily leave, or somehow they'll be replaced by people who are committed to peace.
Maybe so.